So I spend my fair share of time on social media. Some might call it trolling. Me, I see it more as keeping my finger on the pulse. Not just with what's happening in Vietnamese society today, but also in regard to how Vietnam and its people are perceived by those like you overseas. And what I've noticed in Facebook groups and in YouTube comment sections is that there's often misinformation and misunderstanding around what's true and what's not about Vietnam. So in this video, I'm going to go out on a limb and deep dive into the well that is my 15 years of lived experience in Vietnam, all of it here in Saigon, to bust some of those myths you might have about Vietnam, its people, and its culture. And along the way, hopefully enlighten you a little bit more about this unique country. So let's get into some myth busting, shall we? Well, on the surface, things are pretty cheap in Vietnam. In fact, just in my last video, I mentioned how reasonable the cost of living is here, especially compared to Australia, where I'm from. That's if you don't buy luxury items from home, like this black gold. Outrageously priced here though. And for travellers, there are great deals to be had with accommodation, eating, drinking and travel experiences. But over the past decade or so, Vietnam has strived to change its image as just a cheap spot for a holiday. A perception travel industry boffins here are grappling with as they try to lure so-called high-spending tourists to our shores. Ooh la la. It's very, very different from when I came here backpacking in the late 90s. These days, if you're a bit more of a flash packer like me, or you just simply enjoy the finer things in life when you travel, there are plenty of ways to part with your much sought after US or Aussie dollars, pounds, or hey, even rubles. There are luxury resorts right up and down the coast, some featuring international standard golf courses. One has a casino, and the Michelin Guide in the past few years has recognised a number of restaurants as world-class in Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi and Da Nang. And there are cocktail bars all over the joint where you can wash down your duck confit and caviar in style. There are also luxury boat cruises up in Ha Long Bay and down here in the Mekong Delta that even take you across into Cambodia and back. And you don't even have to get your feet dirty. And don't forget, Vietnam is home to the world's largest cave system, where adventure tourists spend $3,000 for the privilege of spending 4 days underground in the dark. Where do they go to the toilet? Yeah, nah. So seeing I've hit the ground running with travel, let's get this one out of the way. Travelling in Vietnam, like anywhere, has its risks. You know, back in the days travelling Vietnam for me, dangerous was like wondering whether our overloaded vintage bus was going to roll over and tumble down a ravine in the middle of the night. These days, it's more like, will the Wi-Fi cut out at any time in my mountain lodge? But seriously, yeah, I can totally see why people would think travelling here is dangerous when their main news source is, well, Instagram. But let's face it, travel infrastructure here is still a bit shonky, meaning the highways can resemble scenes from Mad Max Fury Road, and the yearly road toll is testament to that. And the alternatives, if you don't want to fly, are going by train. It's safe enough, but there's only one track really. And those coffins on wheels, sleeper buses, yeah, I don't recommend those. But having said that, things are changing. More and more modern highways are being constructed all the time, and Vietnam's air travel industry has come a long way, with no major incidents or faults that come to mind, except for the delays and in-flight meals, baggage losses, and nothing to do at the airport. Now, you might be someone who's a little bit older watching this. I mean, you were around in the 60s and 70s and are old enough to remember the war. You may have even served in it. Well, 50 years on, the war is one of the last things on people's minds here, especially among the younger generation. So if you're Western and harbour any reservations about how you might be treated here because of history, forget about it. So much has happened since then, and the Vietnamese have moved on. They embrace travellers who were former enemies and are curious about where they're from and what they do. And is it safe for solo travellers, especially female travellers? Well, Vietnam enjoys a stable political and social environment at the moment. Just exercise caution as you would elsewhere. Try not to get yourself in precarious situations, and you should be right. Now, this topic came up in a roundabout kind of way in my previous video, in which I cautioned viewers about how to treat Vietnamese women. Okay, I'm actually no real expert myself, but passport bros, look away now because you're probably not going to like what you hear in this one. That also goes for the 2-week millionaires and white knights out there. You know who you are. Because despite the stereotype of Asian women being submissive and trained to live and thrive in patriarchal households, this doesn't hold true for Vietnamese women, at least in my experience. Most of the Vietnamese women I know or come across in the marketplaces, in the banks, in the bars, are strong, confident individuals who are career-driven, but at the same time play an extremely important role in the home as well and have to deal with stresses related to family that I can't even begin to imagine. Yes, there are still traditional women who grow up in traditional households in which they're expected to defer to the man of the house and carry that into adulthood. And yes, Vietnamese culture is still by and large a patriarchal society, at least on the surface. But you can bet that behind that man of the house is a woman or female figure pushing them, in some cases, out the door. Divorce rates are higher than you think, actually. But it's all for the good of the family. There is some way to go, it seems, in some homes, as evidenced by regular reports of domestic violence. But beyond that, we don't have to look too far back in Vietnamese history to get an understanding of the place women in Vietnamese society hold. Just search online for Vietnam's legendary long-haired army. It's not hard to see why this might be a stereotype about Vietnam because social media is saturated with best pho and best banh mi content, and there are pages dedicated just to pho and banh mi. I mean, white people even argue online about what constitutes a traditional banh mi. Such is the Sanger's profile. White bread arguing about white bread. I guess this has also come about by the amount of work the Vietnamese diaspora around the world has put into raising the profile of these dishes, but it also speaks to the simplicity of them and how they're a great gateway into exploring Vietnamese cuisine. However, it might come as a surprise to you that pho probably isn't the most popular dish here in Saigon. And that honour probably goes to bún bò Huế, the earthy, pungent and slightly spicy noodle soup that hails from central Vietnam. Bún bò Huế joints are everywhere down here, and so are gom tam joints, a quintessential Saigon dish with a pork chop and rice, and hủ tiếu joints, whose heritage traces back to Khmer cuisine. The list goes on, but probably the dish that surprised me the most when I first came to live here was gom gà, basically fried chicken and rice. It flew in the face, I know, dad joke, that it's healthy and great for you, always served with fresh herbs and greens and so on. But I have no idea who introduced fried chicken to Vietnam, but damn you, whoever you are. No surprises, this one makes the list because it only takes one example of someone scamming another for the story to do the rounds on social media, and that sticks like shit to a blanket. And then you suddenly have the bigots creeping out of the woodwork and things get blown out of proportion, and soon enough people start piling on and so on and so forth. If you hang around the wrong expats for too long or lurk in expat groups online, then chances are you'll come away with the perception that all Vietnamese are out to get you and that they'll rob you blind and that they can't be trusted. In my experience, nothing can be further from the truth. The Vietnamese are extremely proud of their culture and are therefore sensitive to how it's portrayed publicly and how experiences and interactions rub off on visitors. So they'll make an effort to do the right thing or remedy a situation. In any case, it often turns out to be a breakdown in communication that leads to a misunderstanding, not a premeditated attempt to screw you over. In fact, the people you've got to look out for are the ones most likely from your own country or background, for example, Westerners. In my time here, I've been wronged by 3 people that I can think of: a New Zealander, an Aussie, and an Englishman. Sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? I wish it was, though. who either colluded to sabotage my career or left the country without paying me a substantial amount of money I was owed. So, in my experience living here, your enemies will come from within, so to speak. All the more reason to make more Vietnamese friends, I reckon. Saving face is something you'll hear a lot when people talk about Asian cultures for some reason. And the Japanese tend to be on the end of this one a fair bit, and I can see how that comes about because saving face is about preserving one's honour or dignity, avoiding humiliation or embarrassment in the face of having made a mistake or having done something wrong. You see, Japanese culture is very much about harmony and everyone in society falling into line, so to speak. In fact, the Japanese have a proverb that goes, "The nail that sticks out gets hammered down." I lived in Japan for 3 years in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I witnessed that. If you stand out, they'll knock you down so you conform to societal expectations. Now, Vietnam isn't Japan, at least on the level of saving face scale. You'll definitely come across instances of face saving here for sure, no doubt. A reluctance to admit any wrongdoing or to own a mistake in fear of being embarrassed publicly is a sign of that. As an example, maybe on check-in at your hotel, someone has forgotten to upgrade you to the room promised over the phone or via email. So don't necessarily expect an apology back, or at least an explicit acknowledgement that they simply just fucked up. It generally won't come. In Western culture, we're constantly told to own up to things, or at least my generation was. Whereas here, not so much. So this is where a difference in culture kicks in. Vietnamese culture is a high context culture in which communication cues are less explicit, where meaning is conveyed more through vibes and others just getting it. Did you love that scientific explanation? Now, this is in comparison to low context cultures like mine, in which we rely more on explicit and direct forms of communication. So that generally doesn't work here, by the way. What really sets Vietnam and Japan apart in this aspect is that not once can I remember seeing a Japanese person blow up in public, whereas here, it's not uncommon to come across disagreements in public where everybody's washing is hung out to dry. It can be quite the show. It's interesting that this one has come up because just recently I was saying to my wife that on a day-to-day basis, you might be excused for thinking that Vietnamese people have a look. Even Vietnamese people themselves say that they can pick out a Vietnamese person a mile off. But it's not until you go to a festival like at Tet, which happens each year, when you can really see how diverse looking Vietnamese people are. You see, Vietnam's population comprises 54 ethnic groups, with something like 80 to 90% of people identifying as Kinh, who are said to have originated from the north and north central regions. And they look different from, say, the Khmers in the Mekong Delta and the Chams on the central coast, and different again to those of Malay origin here in Saigon who might be Muslim, and those of Chinese heritage in Jolon. And this might be news for you. They come in all shapes and sizes, as we all do. So much so that my wife, who's Filipino, often gets mistaken as Vietnamese. I think she looks very Filipino, but anyway. Not only that, the different ethnic groups also have different cultures, dress, languages and dialects, which reminds me of years ago when I was acquainted with an expat family here, and the wife was Indonesian and they had a nanny from the central highlands of Vietnam. Now, the Indonesian lady didn't speak Vietnamese and the Vietnamese lady, who was of Cham heritage, didn't speak English, but they were able to communicate effectively via their native languages because of their shared linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Pretty fascinating, hey? So it's not until you hear stories like this or go deep into the Mekong Delta or up into the highlands or up on the border with China or attend a festival that attracts a lot of people that you really get a sense of how diverse looking Vietnamese people really are and how multicultural Vietnam actually is. No doubt you've heard the expression, or maybe you've even said it yourself, seen one, seen them all, in reference to the number of Buddhist pagodas you see in Vietnam. Therefore, you'd be forgiven for thinking that everyone here is Buddhist. Well, you'd be wrong, at least according to my sources. Data on things like this can be sketchy, so please don't take these figures I'm about to give you as, well, gospel. And I need to tread carefully on this point. So if you're looking for more info, by all means do your own research online for it. I've left a link in the description where you can get started. Now, first things first. Vietnam is a one-party socialist republic, so that should give you some idea as to its historical position on religion, and so therefore it can be considered as a secular state. In fact, the Vietnamese government officially declares Vietnam as atheist, but the constitution does allow for religious freedom. According to the Vietnam government's Committee for Religious Affairs, there are over 26.5 million followers of religion in Vietnam, which constitutes about 27% of the total population. The committee's Religions and Religious Policy from 2023 states, and I quote, "There is no discrimination on the grounds of religion and belief," and that the state, I quote again, "has always affirmed that freedom of religion and belief is one of the fundamental human rights." To that end, as of March 2020, and this may have been updated since, there are around 41 state-recognised religious organisations in Vietnam, while the state recognises that 95% of the Vietnamese population maintain some kind of worshipping beliefs, be it ancestral worship, worship related to the human cycle of birth, adulthood and death, worship related to occupation, and worship of gods and saints and so on. Now, according to one source, in 2021, there were around 14 million Buddhists in Vietnam, representing just over 13% of the population, while Catholics ranked as the second largest group with more than 7 million followers at about 6% of the population. Interestingly, homegrown religions like Hoa Hao and Cao Dai only represent around 1% of the population each. So there you have it, despite the feeling you get of the country being overwhelmingly Buddhist as you wander around the towns and cities here. It's actually not the case, and the Vietnamese people, if anything, are more polytheistic in their religious practices, meaning they like to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that as the occasion requires. No matter how much credence you give to English language proficiency survey results that come out in the news each year, there always seems to be a collective gasp online at Vietnam's seemingly perpetually low ranking in them. In fact, there was shock horror as recently as last November when Vietnam dropped 5 places into a so-called low proficiency category created by an international English language teaching organisation. By this measure, Vietnam ranks globally at number 63 of 116 countries surveyed and comes in at number 8 of 23 countries and territories in Asia. I don't know about you, but I reckon 8th in Asia ain't too bad. Especially when the countries ahead of Vietnam are ones like Singapore, the Philippines and Malaysia, countries that have a long history of English as the language of instruction in schools. But let's look outside of educational institutions here in Vietnam though, and talk about what it's like on the ground. On a daily basis, I hear English being spoken quite a bit. Yeah, I do live in a more affluent neighbourhood where people are likely to have had more opportunities to study English, but I find vendors in marketplaces, baristas in cafes, workers who come to my house to repair things, people from all walks of life willing to have a crack at speaking to me in English. Even the other day, the gas bottle delivery guy was up for a chat, and an 80-year-old lady down an alleyway in District 4 was looking for a good old chinwag. Hi Nop, if you're watching. In fact, sometimes it's to the detriment of my Vietnamese because it's common for someone to answer me in English after I've asked them something in Vietnamese. I don't know, maybe my Vietnamese is even shitter than I think it is, but the point is they're willing to have a go no matter their proficiency. But yes, there are difficulties with language barriers when accessing government services, for example, but somehow you work your way through it with Google Translate, gestures and pen and paper. You know, you just need to psych yourself up when you decide to go to these places to give yourself a little bit of time so you just don't lose your shit. But yeah, you know, it's never smooth sailing and there's always bound to be some kind of miscommunication. Anyway, if you're travelling here and following the well-beaten tourist trail, then you'll be surprised at how proficient in English the Vietnamese you come in contact with are. And in places where people speak less English, just treat it as part of the experience. And anyway, often those interactions with people who don't speak your language turn out to be some of the most enriching experiences you'll ever have on your travels. Okay, that's about it for this one. Can you think of any other myths I may have missed out on and need busting? If so, let me know in the comments. I think there are a few more I could have added to this list. Anyway, I hope you liked it. If you did, please share it with your friends. Take care and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.